Okay, another world building one. So, this one I kind of wanted to talk about. I don't know. I guess implications again. You know, there's always implications. But I wanted to talk about like individual species and stuff a little bit, and and monsters and other things. But we don't have the world like the basics. I mean, we do have the base, like, there's a lot to talk about when you're world building, especially when there's a group of you all doing it. There's lots of ideas flying back and forth, something one of you never considered. That it just keeps happening over and over again. Part of the fun of world building in a group. But one thing, and this is something I've kind of thought about for a while, like different types of monsters and stuff, certain ones, like what exactly are they? Particularly the big standouts for me, which like get really ill-defined and they become really setting specific, are demons and fiends, and then to a lesser extent dragons, because dragons always kind of change depending on the setting, but like in a setting agnostic way, how do you define those two things, demons and dragons? First off, in most D&D settings, demons kind of get broken down into three different variations: demons, devils, and the Yugoloths nobody ever uses. Yep, I am taking a right. Fuck you guys. Woohoo! So, what is a demon? It's just is it an evil spirit creature from another plane of existence? That's usually what it is. Some settings, it's like more of sometimes they become just like essentially evil ghosts, like irredeemable people that have died in horrible ways and haunt the world as horrific, twisted versions of themselves with supernatural powers, because I guess if you're a murderer, you get rewarded by being able to murder more. In some settings. And then in other settings, they're basically just like mutant vampires. Like, it's all, and that's usually if a setting doesn't have some sort of evil spirit creature from hell, then demons can kind of be whatever. Like, look at the anime and manga Demon Slayer. They're mutant vampires. That's all they really are. But they call them demons because it's cooler, I guess. A lot of the things they can do are a little more fanciful in some ways, but they're basically just demons. Like, everything they can do is rooted in their ability to drink blood and regenerate. They can access some semi-supernatural powers, but they're just vampires. Whereas in other settings, there's like a lot more rules, where they're like an evil spirit creature from another plane of existence, usually some sort of like negative or evil plane or some twisted plane, whether it's hell or the abyss or the demon dimension. And then in those cases, darn, loud road. Ooh, damn. Anyway, I've also got a few more loose things in the back of my van today. So then usually in those cases where they're an evil spirit creature from another dimension, there's usually rules for them to come into this dimension. You know, whether they have to be summoned, they have to possess something, they have to fight a rift to come through. Like, and there's lots of different permutations and reasons and ways to do it. But they're useful in that way. Like, making them something completely alien is always a really cool idea. You know, making demons the equivalent of, you know, Lovecraftian old ones is always a really cool idea. Which something D&D kind of separates even further. In most D&D settings, there aren't, like, demons aren't unknowable old ones. Sometimes they are, but they usually aren't. And unknowable old ones are their own separate class of thing. Like, from the Far Realm, which is just a different dimension with weird evil spirit creatures. There's like 7 different types of weird evil spirit creatures. And, you know, an individual setting isn't going to need all of them. You're not going to need devils, demons, Yugoloths, Far Realm aberrations, star spawn. Like, you're not going to need all those things. But you could use them. So, you know, you kind of have to think about, like, what a demon is. Like, what do you want it to be? Because there's implications for it. And then, circling back a little bit, what is a dragon? In a lot of settings, they're just big reptilian apex predators that can sometimes breathe fire. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. Sometimes they breathe other stuff. But I think, like, my personal kind of favorite variation of them, especially in a more magically inclined setting, is they are reptilian apex predators. Loud section again. I'll wait a second. Keep you in suspense. How's your day going? Whenever you're watching this. What are you wearing? So, for me, I like the idea of dragons as a reptilian apex predator. Why are they reptilian? I don't know. Not a whole lot of reason why they're reptilian specifically. In the real world, it's probably because there's a a deep-seated subconscious fear of reptilian creatures, snakes, those types of things, because in our evolutionary prehistory, we were eaten by a lot of reptiles when we were little shrew type things, you know, way back. But so that's one reason they're reptilian. But otherwise, they are reptilian apex predators, like 6th time I've said that. But they're also kind of apex, or like the highest order being in the natural world that is suffused with magic of the natural world, that type of thing. And in the same way, like demons and other maybe demon lords are like this for the negative planes. Angels and gods are like this for the higher upper planes, positive plane, like, you know, whatever it is. Every type of plane has a creature like this. There's something that is the apex kind of entity that sits at the highest point of the natural order. But in the material plane, or the real world, or whatever you want to say, dragons kind of occupy this niche. But one of the things about any given world is that natural orders are constantly shifting. And dragons are beset by both sentient life, humanoids, well, other sentient life, because dragons are sentient. So they don't have to be. That can be an interesting wrinkle. Like, if you make it so that dragons are non-sapient, like they're not intelligent and particularly self-aware. They can't talk, they can't, like, you know, form centuries-long plans, but they're still walking natural disasters. You know, like Monster Hunter. Dragons, in Monster Hunter, dragons are like supernaturally powerful entities, but they're just big animals. Maybe I like that the most. Maybe. Again, it has different implications. If you do that, then it's easier to explain why there's a bunch of dragons. Because if they were like super smart and super powerful, why didn't they take over the world? Why don't they rule everything? And you usually have to come up with reasons why they aren't. They're arrogant, they don't work together, they're super slow to reproduce, all those things. But if they're big animals that are supernaturally powerful, then it's easier to explain why there's a lot of them. I think I might like that the most from like a player perspective, but you know, it's back and forth. Otherwise, just, you know, to me, that's kind of what dragons are. Like, there's lots of different variations, and the kind you put in your setting, you know, helps define the setting and flesh things out a lot. And then the last little part for this video I wanted to talk about are individual species and cultures and kind of, I guess, a little bit of bioessentialism. You know, it's kind of touching the idea on, like, certain races and species have intrinsic properties that are always present. This is kind of the idea of, like, orcs are always evil, dark elves are always evil. I don't like that as much. Like, making a whole race evil is really kind of a cultural thing to me. If you want a whole, like, orcs to be evil all the time, it has to be cultural. Making them evil biologically evil, gets really weird, and then they're no longer people. Like, because they don't have free will, they don't have a choice to not be evil. They might be able to make little choices inside the realm of being evil, but they're still just evil. They can't choose the whole moral spectrum, and that kind of makes them not people, which is really weird and gets into some weird philosophical questions, if you want to dive into that. If you don't want to dive into it, they're just monster people that want to kill you, so you shoot them. Which, if you're trying to map real world stuff on, gets really touchy. But otherwise, I much more like the idea of, yeah, like, different species can have intrinsic abilities and properties, but I don't like to subscribe specific moralities to an individual species outside of their culture. And culture gets tricky. So I'm going to bring up two examples. A while ago, this same group plus some more people were doing a big, like a world building game for one of the people. He wanted help kind of like fleshing out his own setting. So by playing this, you kind of shape the world and create different races, affect the world, and kind of populate it. And we all came up with a bunch of different races and species. But there's three, because I didn't get to the third one in the game. But the two, I'm going to talk about all of them. First, I made lizard folk. You know, lizard folk are great to have, and they can have a variety of intrinsic properties. Like, you know, they're hardy people, they've got tougher skin, they're well adapted to surviving in the wild kind of on their own with minimal technology. They've got natural weapons, natural defenses, good immune systems, all those things. And then you can start to give them other, like, little variation properties, like, you know, not exactly sub-races or subspecies, but a wider array of variation within them. Like, you know, some of them can look more like chameleons or skinks or geckos, and they get a little more sneaky. They've got better ability to climb. Maybe they can naturally camouflage themselves. If you really want to get into it, give them a lashing tongue ability, just for, something like that. And then the more kind of normal, like maybe not default, but middle of the road, more populated lizard folk are kind of just, they're larger, they're more like maybe monitor lizard inspired, and they're just a little more kind of middle of the road. They've got a wider array of capabilities. Sometimes they could have climbing, maybe they get poisonous bites, that type of stuff. Then you've got like larger crocodilo forms, where they've got even tougher skin and are even more physically inclined, but they lose the innate climbing abilities. They don't camouflage themselves, something like that. But one thing I gave them, and maybe this is more cultural, I gave them blood magic. They can use their own vitality. They can kill something and use that vitality to fuel both, magic rituals and maybe just pure, more like, I'm going to say boots on the ground, immediate, like offensive and defensive magic. Like, make blades out of blood and fire it at enemies. Like war magic. And I would say that's not something that's necessarily intrinsic to these lizard folk. It's something like any race could learn how to do, but maybe the lizard folk pioneered it, and it being part of their culture, they learn it a lot easier. And then something similar with a mole race I came up with, the Varplin. They're just like underground. They're kind of like dwarves, but they're moles. Culturally, they're all like communist hard workers. They've got like, a species-wide union, basically. Kind of industrialist, but a magic system I gave them was rune carving, where they carve runes onto stuff, and it confers additional properties onto those items. So while they're not necessarily causing big dramatic effects, like say a wizard or a sorcerer or something like that, they are capable of, like, they're more like artificer type magic. And again, that's something other species could learn how to do, but it's part of their culture. They learn it best. And then a third race I never kind of got around to was like this flying peacock race. And they were going to be like this antagonist race, where in that setting they're going to live in these floating cities, and because they can fly and they're the most beautiful, they deserve to rule the world. So they're a kind of evil race, but it's largely cultural. That type of thing is largely cultural. So, you could easily play a peacock person that's not evil. But by and large, they're useful for an evil antagonistic race, if you want that for your game, for your setting, blah, blah, blah. Otherwise, so for this setting, maybe I would make that peacock race something, or, okay, yeah, let's talk about those three versions, those three races in this setting. The peacock race would probably be like a planet side race. They don't have their own moon, maybe, but they're one of the few races that manage to secure some sort of pretty safe haven on the planet. They've got little floating cities that are kind of far away from everything, but they don't have access to teleportation circles, the teleportation corridors that everyone else that lives on the moons have in this setting. So they're a civilization that nobody knows a whole lot about. You go down to the planet and you're subject to, raids and scouting parties from these peacocks. That could be interesting. There's, a whole antagonistic army that you have to deal with when you go down there, outside of just other hunting parties and expeditions from the other moons. Then the Varplin and the lizard folk, I would think they could have moons of their own, but maybe But similarly, maybe the Varplan could also be a largely planet-side race. They live underground. They're also relatively safe. But expeditions that make contact with the Varplan would have much more positive interactions, because the Varplan have this culture of working together. So they're much more open to positive relations. Whereas the lizard folk, I would think, have a moon. They'd probably have a moon. Maybe you could have a contingent of jungle lizard folk somewhere. But that's kind of what I have, mostly. That's all I got for today.